The winter of 2002 came to the Platte River Valley the way old men come to hard decisions, slowly, and with the full weight of long memory behind it. By January, the fields lay under a low white sky. The rows of cut corn stalks stubbled black through the snow, and the farmhouses sat quiet and smoke trailing along the gravel roads as they had for 100 years. Silas Brower's place was 8 miles west of Schuyler, on a quarter section of ground his grandfather had broken with a horse-drawn plow in 1912. The farmstead itself wasn't much to look at by modern standards. A white clapboard house with a covered porch, a red hip-roofed barn that had weathered to the color of dried blood, a machine shed where a 1979 John Deere 4440 tractor sat under a canvas tarp beside an older 4-row planter he'd rebuilt twice, and a chicken coop that no longer housed chickens but still smelled, faintly and permanently, of them. There was also a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the barn, its timbered door green with moss, where Silas kept potatoes, canned goods, and one other thing. A dented tobacco tin, painted red, its lid held closed by a single rubber band. Inside that tin were the seeds. He was 61 years old that winter, Silas Brower, and he had the kind of face that Nebraska gives to men who spend their lives outdoors, deeply lined across the forehead, leather dark at the neck and forearms where the sun could reach, with pale squinting eyes that missed very little and said even less. He was what his neighbors called quietly stubborn, which was the polite way of saying he had never in his adult life done something simply because everyone else was doing it. On cold winter mornings, after his wife Ruth had gone into Schuyler to work her shift at the hardware counter, Silas would come into the kitchen in his wool socks and flannel shirt, pour a mug of coffee from the percolator, and sit at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of him. He'd take off the rubber band carefully, the same one, replaced each spring, and open the lid. Inside were perhaps 24 small paper envelopes, each one labeled in his grandfather's tight Germanic script or his own looser hand, and inside each envelope were corn kernels, the color of old gold, smooth as river stones. He didn't open the envelopes in winter. He just sat with them. He'd pick up an envelope, feel the weight of the seeds shifting inside, and set it down again. It was something between a ritual and a prayer, though Silas would have denied it was either. The seeds had a history, the way most things worth keeping have a history. Carl Brower, Silas's grandfather, had come to Nebraska from the Bavarian flatlands in the spring of 1909, 23 years old, with $40, a steamer trunk, and a determination to farm American ground that his family back in Dorfin had regarded as either admirable or deranged, depending on whom you asked. He'd homesteaded 160 acres in Colfax County, paid a Swedish neighbor $12 for a mule team and a walking plow, and gone to work. The variety of corn he first planted he'd gotten from an old-timer named James Pickett, a man in his 70s who'd been farming the Platte Valley since before the Civil War. Old Pickett had grown this particular strain of open-pollinated dent corn for 30 years, selecting it himself from an even older variety, and he gave Carl a cotton sack of seed kernels and some advice. Don't ever plant the prettiest ears. Plant the toughest ones. Carl Brower, being the kind of man who listened carefully and remembered everything, had taken that advice to heart. Through the 1910s and 1920s, as commercial seed companies began appearing with their hybrid varieties, bred for yield, bred for uniformity, bred for sale, Carl kept selecting his own. Every fall, before the corn picker rattled through the rows, he walked his fields on foot, and he picked by hand the ears from plants that had done something extraordinary. Survived the dry spells, stood upright after wind, set a good ear even when others in the same row had failed. He hung those ears to dry in the barn, and in spring he shelled them by hand, checking each kernel between his thick fingers for firmness and weight. He kept notes in a small gray ledger. Things like, August drought. This plant held color 4 days longer than neighbors. Good root, deep root, keep this line. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s were when his selections proved themselves. Neighbors lost crops to heat and desiccation. Carl Brower lost some too, but not all. His root system selection, year after year choosing plants whose stalks remained green longest during late summer stress, had, without his ever knowing the botanical term for it, selected for unusually deep root architecture. Corn plants that could reach for water 18 inches, 2 feet, even deeper into the subsoil, long after the top foot of ground had baked to something resembling red brick. He never sold the seeds. He gave them to neighbors who asked during the Dust Bowl years, then went back to keeping them close when the crisis passed, and people forgot about such things. When he died in 1967, he left the tin box to Silas's father, Gerhard, who maintained it through the lean years of the 1970s and through the brutal farm crisis of the 1980s, years when half the neighbors in this county signed their land over to the bank and left for the cities, and Gerhard Brauer held on by renting out the back 40 and fixing other men's equipment for cash. He left the tin to Silas in 1988 along with the farm, the debts, and a handwritten note tucked under the rubber band that said simply, "Dies Samen Lügen nicht." These seeds do not lie. It was the first Tuesday in March of 2002 when the meeting was called at the Colfax County Grange Hall, a low concrete block building on the edge of Schuyler, whose walls were hung with county fair ribbons, and a framed photograph of Eisenhower that nobody had thought to take down in 40 years. Silas came because Ruth told him he should, and because he wanted the free coffee, and because he knew his neighbors would be there, and it was a long winter, and conversation was scarce. He drove in from the farm in his 1994 Ford F-150, the heater on full against a raw March wind, the radio catching a Farm Bureau report out of Lincoln about commodity prices. About 30 farmers turned out, settling into folding metal chairs that scraped against the concrete floor, talking about seed prices and diesel, and a new Walmart that had just opened in Columbus that some thought was progress and others thought was the beginning of the end. The smell of the room was coffee and damp wool coats, and the particular sharp smell of men who worked outdoors. The man from the seed company arrived right at 7 o'clock, the way company men always did, punctually, with nice shoes, driving a white Chevrolet Suburban with a corporate logo on the door. His name was Dr. Robert Bennett, and he was perhaps 40 years old, trim and well-pressed in khaki slacks and a royal blue golf shirt with an embroidered logo that read Agrimax Seed Solutions. He shook hands around the room with the practiced ease of a man who shook hands for a living, set up a laptop computer on a folding table at the front of the room, and connected it to a projector that threw a bright logo onto a pull-down screen. Some of the older farmers in the room had never seen a PowerPoint presentation. One of them, old Harold Wiegert, leaned over to Silas and whispered that it looked like something from a television commercial, which is exactly what it was. Dr. Bennett's pitch was smooth, thorough, and impressively confident. Agrimax Seed Solutions, he explained, had spent 12 years and something close to $200 million developing their new flagship corn hybrid, the AX 7700 series. It was engineered with a proprietary trait stack that included resistance to European corn borer, tolerance to 2 major herbicides. And this was the part he emphasized, leaning forward and speaking slowly. What he called optimized water use efficiency, a term he defined as the plant's ability to produce maximum yield per unit of water input. He showed yield trials. He showed graphs. He showed photographs of corn so tall and uniform it looked like it had been planted by a machine, which in fact it had been. He talked about the future of farming, about how data-driven agriculture was going to save the family farm, about how his company's agronomists could help any farmer in this room double their yields in 5 years. The farmers listened. Some nodded. Some asked careful questions about price. Dr. Bennett's seeds cost $142 per 80,000 kernel bag, enough for roughly 2.5 acres at the recommended plant population. That was about 40% more than what most of them were paying for quality hybrids at the co-op. He had a payment plan. He also had a contract. 1 page, small print. Farmers who purchased AX 7700 seed agreed not to save any portion of the crop for replanting. Standard technology licensing agreement, Dr. Bennett said cheerfully. You'll see it's quite simple. The room was quiet for a moment. These were men who had grown up watching their fathers walk the fields at harvest time with a grain sack, selecting the best ears for next year's seed. The contract sat in their laps like a small but irreversible confession that something had changed in the world of farming, and not necessarily for the better. It was in this silence that Silas spoke up. He raised his hand from the back row, the way a schoolboy does, and when Dr. Bennett nodded at him he said, in a voice that was flat and conversational and carried perfectly in the concrete room, "I'm wondering about root depth. In your yield trials, what did root depth look like for AX 7700 under moisture stress?" Dr. Bennett smiled the smile of a man who has heard every variation of this question. Our trials show excellent performance under standard field conditions. The optimized water use efficiency trait. Under moisture stress, Silas said again. How deep did the roots go? Dr. Bennett clicked to a slide that showed a cross-section diagram of a corn plant. The root zone depicted extended perhaps 14 to 16 inches below the soil surface. The root architecture is optimized for the modern, managed production environment, he said. Silas looked at the slide for a moment. 14 inches, he said, mostly to himself. I'm sorry. My grandfather's corn roots to 6 feet, Silas said. In a dry year. There was a brief pause. Dr. Bennett had the social intelligence to smile rather than laugh outright. Well, he said, that's quite a claim. Open-pollinated varieties have their place. They're wonderful from a historical perspective. Like living museum pieces, really. He chuckled, and several of the farmers chuckled with him. The way people do when they're in a room with an authority figure and a punchline. But in terms of modern yield, disease resistance, and standability, they simply can't compete. A man growing open-pollinated corn in 2002 is essentially, he paused, searching for the right phrase. Well, he's farming with a Model T when everyone else has a combine. Another chuckle from the room. Bigger this time. Silas didn't say anything more. He sat with his coffee cup in his hands and looked at the projection screen. And his face was the face of a man who has decided to let the world prove his point for him. He drove home under a sky full of cold stars, the truck heater working hard, the radio now playing old country music out of Columbus. He didn't tell Ruth much about the meeting. He just said that they were selling seeds for $142 a bag, and that the roots went 14 inches deep. Ruth, who had grown up in this valley and knew what a dry summer could do, set down her book and looked at him across the kitchen table. What are you going to plant? She asked. He jerked his head toward the root cellar. She nodded and went back to her book. By mid-April, the ground had warmed enough in the south-facing slopes that Silas started thinking about planting dates. He walked his fields every morning that week in rubber boots, pushing a soil thermometer into the dirt at 2-inch depth the way his grandfather had pressed a bare thumb, checking not just the temperature but the feel of the ground, whether it crumbled or smeared between the fingers, whether it was ready to accept the seed and help it to life, or whether it would just sit there and rot. Corn goes in the ground when the soil holds 60 degrees at a 2-inch depth for 3 days running, with warming weather ahead. That's what the books say. Karl Brauer had said something slightly different. The ground is ready when it smells alive again. Silas had come to believe these were the same instruction, just in different languages. He planted in the last week of April that year, a touch early by county standards. But the forecast was warm, and he'd known this ground for 30 years and trusted it. He hitched the 4-row planter behind the 4440 and went to work, the big diesel engine turning over with the deep, steady note of a machine that had been properly maintained, belts and chains freshly greased, disc openers sharpened and adjusted so they cut the soil rather than tearing it. The seed plates on his planter had been fitted with cells sized for his grandfather's corn, which ran slightly larger and more irregular in kernel shape than modern hybrids, a fact that sometimes caused problems with the newer vacuum disc planters some neighbors used, but that the old finger and cell plate mechanism handled without complaint. He planted at 28,000 seeds per acre, a population somewhat lower than the 34,000 Dr. Bennett's literature recommended for AX 7700. But Karl Brauer's corn didn't respond well to crowding, any more than Karl Brauer himself had. He planted 180 acres. His neighbor to the east, a younger man named Dale Krieger, who'd signed the Agrimax contract at the March meeting, planted his 320 acres in AX 7700 at the recommended population, laying it down with a new 12-row GPS-guided planter that cost more than Silas's whole equipment inventory. Dale was a good farmer and a decent neighbor. He wasn't a fool. He was just a different kind of farmer, one who believed the future was in the brochures, and who had a bank note that required him to maximize his yields every year whether he believed in the brochures or not. The spring rains came through May in reasonable shape. Both men's corn germinated well. By the first week of June, the rows were showing clean and green across the county, and on his evening walks along the field edge Silas felt the particular satisfaction that comes only from watching plants push up through ground you've known your whole life. A satisfaction that has no equivalent in any other kind of work, that no spreadsheet has ever adequately described. Dale Krieger's AX 7700 was taller by mid-June, greener, more uniform. It looked exactly like the photographs in the brochure. Silas's corn was shorter, darker-leaved, less uniform. The individual plants varying slightly in height and formed the way living things do when they haven't been processed into perfect sameness. A couple of people who drove past on County Road 12 and looked over at Silas's fields that June may have thought, if they thought about it at all, that his corn looked a little rough compared to what was going up on the east side of the road. They would not be thinking that in August. The 4th of July that year was 93 degrees in Schuyler, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what came after. The rain stopped. It stopped the way rain sometimes stops on the Great Plains. Not gradually, not with a forecaster's warning, but simply and completely, as if a valve had been closed somewhere up in the machinery of the atmosphere. The sky stayed blue and white and brilliant and merciless for days, then a week, then 2 weeks. By the middle of July, the National Weather Service station in Lincoln was already using the word drought in its weekly summaries, and older farmers were pulling out the vocabulary they kept stored in the back of their minds from the 1950s and the 1930s, words like parched and baked and done for. The temperature hit 102 degrees in Colfax County on July 18th. It hit 104 on July 22nd. The radio said the high-pressure system sitting over the Central Plains was as stubborn as any in 40 years, and the long-range forecast showed no relief. Corn, in the 3rd week of July, is at the most critical point of its entire existence. This is when the tassels emerge from the top of the plant and the silks push out from the developing ears, and pollen must travel from tassel to silk for kernels to set. The whole process is exquisitely sensitive to temperature and moisture. At 95 degrees, pollen viability starts to drop. At 100, it drops sharply. At 104, in the absence of soil moisture, most corn plants go into a kind of desperate self-preservation, pulling water from wherever they can to protect the most vital tissues, which means the silks desiccate before pollination can complete, and kernels never form where kernels should have been. Dale Krieger's AX 7700 was 6 feet 4 inches tall and looked magnificent on July 15th. Its tassels were gold and full and throwing pollen in clouds on the morning breeze. But the root zone of those magnificent plants went 14 inches into the ground, and by the 3rd week of July, 14 inches of Nebraska soil was dry as a clay pot. The plants pulled moisture upward to their leaves. The leaves curled lengthwise, the way corn does under stress, rolling inward to reduce their surface area. Then the plants pulled what was left from wherever it remained, and the curling got worse. The tassels shed early and incompletely. The silks emerged brown at the tips, which is the botanical equivalent of a cry for help. By the end of July, Silas could walk to the corner of Dale's field and see it happening. The slowly collapsing beauty of corn under fatal stress, the leaves going gray-green and papery, the stalks beginning to lose their rigidity. It wasn't just Dale's field. It was the county. The extension office in Schuyler started getting calls in the 3rd week of July. The county agent, a patient man named Ron Quisenberry who'd been doing this job since 1981, drove the back roads and tried to count the losses, and what he found in field after field was the same story. Modern hybrids, heavily fertilized, on root systems that had never been bred to dig for water, beginning to fail. Not all at once, not dramatically, but failing quietly, irreversibly, in the way that a good year slowly becomes a disaster year when the sky doesn't cooperate. The river bottom fields with irrigation pivots were still all right. The pivots ran day and night, drawing from the Platte, and the center pivot rigs wheeled their slow circles over green fields like mechanical miracles, which in that summer they were. But 2/3 of the county's corn acres weren't under pivots. They were dryland acres, dependent on rain that wasn't coming, and the men who farmed them were beginning to do that particular math that farm families have always done in dry years. How much crop loss can we absorb? How much do we have in reserve? How many years like this can we survive? Ron Quisenberry drove out to see Silas on a Thursday morning in late July, primarily because he'd passed the Brower place 3 times that week on his road survey, and each time it had made him stop the truck. He pulled his county pickup to the shoulder on County Road 12 and sat for a full minute looking across Silas's south field before he got out. The corn was dark green. Not the strained, fighting to hold it green of a plant under stress. not the pale uniformity of irrigated ground. Dark, deep, almost blue-green in the morning light, the kind of color that means a plant is not merely surviving, but genuinely unbothered. The leaves were flat and wide and unrolled. The tassels had shed well. He could see the spent pollen husks at the tips, the silks just past peak, which meant pollination had proceeded as it should. There was even a morning breeze lifting the leaves, and the whole field moved together like something breathing normally when everything else in the county was holding its breath. He got out of the truck and walked to the field edge and knelt down. He pushed a hand shovel into the soil between two plants and dug with his fingers. At 10 inches, the soil was dry. At 14 inches, it was still dry. At 18 inches, he hit the first real moisture, a coolness in the earth that surprised him. And the roots, he could see them in the side wall of the hole he'd dug. They went past 18 inches, past 2 feet, following a prescription written into them through 70 years of careful selection, reaching for something far below the drought zone. He drove up the lane and found Silas mending a section of wire fence along the cattle pen, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had never learned to rush because there was always more work than time, and he'd long ago made his peace with that. "Your corn looks good," Ron said. Silas pulled a wire tie with his pliers. "It knows how to be dry." Ron stood there a moment. Who else in the county is growing anything like this? Silas thought about it. Harold Wiegert keeps about 40 acres of an old strain his father saved. Leonard Bush might still have some of his grandfather's white corn, but I don't know for certain. "I'm going to need to talk to you about that seed," Ron said. "After harvest. If it goes the way I think it's going." Silas glanced at him, and there might have been something in his eyes, not triumph exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a man who has been patient a long time and is now watching the world catch up to what he already knew. "Come by in September," he said. August was the month that broke things. The heat didn't relent. It built, day by day, adding half a degree here and there until the thermometers at the Schuyler elevator were regularly showing 106, 107, once 109 degrees in the shade. The ground cracked along old plow lines. The creek beds went to dust. Cattle stood in whatever shade they could find and breathed in the shallow, panting way that livestock do in serious heat, and the farmers who could get extra water to them did, and the ones who couldn't started making decisions they would remember for the rest of their lives. Agrimax Seed Solutions sent a regional agronomist out in the second week of August, a young man in a company truck and a cap with the same logo as Dr. Bennett's golf shirt. He drove the fields and took photographs and went back to his laptop and generated a stress assessment report that concluded, in careful corporate language, that the AX 7700 performance in the unusual climatic conditions of summer 2002 had been suboptimal relative to standard trials, and that Agrimax looked forward to reviewing the data and improving future product iterations. Dale Krieger read the report twice and then put it in a drawer. He was going to lose roughly 60% of his corn crop. He'd known it since the last week of July, when the ears on his AX 7700 had come out light and short, the kernels failing to fill at the tip ends of the cobs, the telltale sign of incomplete pollination and insufficient moisture during grain fill. A 60% crop loss on 320 acres of corn at the commodity prices of 2002, with a land payment and an equipment note both due in the fall, was a number Dale sat with at his kitchen table at night and didn't share with his wife yet because he was still working out what it meant. Down County Road 12, 8 miles west, a different calculation was being made. Silas's corn had set ears. They weren't large by AX 7700 standards. His grandfather's variety had never been about record-breaking ears. The cobs were modest in length, running maybe 7 inches, with rows somewhat irregular by hybrid standards. But they were full. Kernels packed tight from tip to butt end, dense and heavy the way the old corn got when it had found its water deep in the earth and pulled it patiently up all summer long. He did a hand count in the third week of August, pulling sample ears from across the field, shelling a portion and estimating. He figured he was looking at somewhere between 120 and 130 bushels per acre. That was not, he would be the first to admit, a spectacular yield. In a good year, Dale's AX 7700 would have produced 180, maybe 200 bushels per acre. The new hybrids were genuinely capable of what the brochures claimed, under the conditions the brochures had assumed. But 120 bushels per acre of real corn, in the drought of 2002, was more than spectacular. It was a miracle. It was the county's entire hope of coming out of that summer with anything at all. The phone started ringing in mid-August. Farmers, neighbors, people Silas hadn't spoken to in years. Ron Quisenberry called twice. The County Farm Bureau called. Someone from the Lincoln Journal-Star called, and Silas let the answering machine get it. The question was always the same. Do you have seed to spare? The custom harvester Silas used every year, a man named Tom Vesely who ran a two-combine crew out of Clarkson, came through the last week of September. The air had finally cooled by then, the nights dropping into the 40s, and the sky had gone from its brutal summer blue to the softer, deeper blue of fall. A northwest wind came through on harvest morning that smelled of the first frost somewhere far to the north, and the Brower corn stood in that wind with its dry, rustling stalks, its full ears hanging down in the husk, patient as anything. Tom Vesely's older machine, a 1980s era John Deere 7720 combine he'd kept running with something between mechanical skill and stubbornness, made its first pass through the field at 7:15 in the morning, the six-row corn head gathering the stalks, the machine translating everything that had happened that summer, the heat, the dust, the deep roots, the 90 years of careful selection, into a flow of yellow grain that ran auguring up into the grain tank with a sound like rushing water. Silas stood at the field edge and watched for a while. Then he walked in alongside the machine for a time, looking at the stover it left behind, checking the quality of the ear pickup, the shelling, the cleaning, all the things you check. Tom's helper, a teenager named Eric, maybe 16, driving the grain cart with an older Massey Ferguson utility tractor, pulled alongside Silas at the field end and grinned down at him from the cab, and Silas lifted 2 fingers from the fence post he was resting against, which in the language of this county meant something between hello and good work and isn't this something. The final yield came in at 127 bushels per acre, below average for a normal year. The best yield in the county by a considerable margin in the year it actually was. By October, there were farmers coming to the Brower place on weekdays and Saturdays, walking the harvested fields to look at the root crowns still visible in the cut rows, drinking coffee in Ruth's kitchen, and asking Silas questions he'd been waiting most of his adult life to be asked. He answered everything without boasting, the way his grandfather had answered questions, directly, practically, without inflation or false modesty. He had enough seed to supply planting stock for about 40 acres of neighbors' fields, which was not nothing, but which was a long way from what the county needed. He gave what he had, and he told everyone who took it that they'd need to select their own seed at harvest, and he explained how, which ears to choose, what to look for in a plant that had endured stress, how to hang the ears to dry and shell them by hand, and do the germination test in late winter with a damp cloth and a warm shelf above the furnace. It takes time, he said, more than once. You can't rebuild a seed line in 1 year. My grandfather spent 30 years getting this corn to where it is. Dr. Robert Bennett came back to Colfax County in November, not for a town meeting, but because the regional agronomist stress assessment report had prompted a customer retention initiative, which is the corporate way of saying that Agrimax had lost significant sales in the wake of the 2002 season and needed to explain itself. He came out to Silas's place on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, and Silas saw the white Suburban coming up the lane and waited on the porch. Bennett got out with his hands in his jacket pockets and walked up toward the porch. He'd put away the golf shirt for November. He was wearing a fleece now with the same corporate logo, but he looked, Silas thought, somewhat reduced. Less like a man selling the future and more like a man who'd had a complicated year. I owe you an apology, Bennett said. Silas considered him for a moment. No, you don't, he said. You believed what the trials showed. The trials weren't wrong. They just didn't test for what happened this summer. Bennett sat down on the porch steps without being invited, which Silas appreciated. It meant the man was genuinely thinking rather than performing an apology for professional purposes. We've been talking internally, Bennett said, about stress tolerance. Our breeders want to know more about what you've got. The root architecture especially. There are people at our company who'd want to talk to you about potentially licensing the genetic material in exchange for. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the harvested fields, bare and dark in the November light. The rows ran to the horizon. A red-tailed hawk hung over the far fence line, motionless in the wind. "These seeds aren't mine to license," Silas said. "They're my grandfather's, and the man who gave them to my grandfather, and every farmer before him who looked at his worst year and said, 'That's the one I'll keep.' You can't put a price tag on something that belongs to everybody and nobody." Bennett didn't argue. He sat there on the porch steps for a while. A cold wind pushed dry leaves across the yard. Then he said quietly, "How did he do it? The root selection. How did your grandfather know which plants to keep?" Silas considered the question the way he considered most things, without hurrying it. "He walked the field," he said. "Every year. He knew every plant. Not by name, but the way you know ground you've been walking for 30 years. He paused. He looked for the ones that didn't ask for help. That winter, in the quiet weeks between Christmas and the New Year, when the snow was back on the fields and the percolator was going and the light outside was the flat white light of the plains in January, Silas sat at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of him. He'd spent the fall selecting with more care than usual, because this year he was selecting not just for himself, but for the 40 families who were now depending on this seed line, who were going to learn, slowly, over the coming years, how to maintain it and improve it the way Karl Brauer had taught through example and Silas now taught through patient explanation. He had told each of them what to look for. He had given each of them his grandfather's instruction in updated language. Look for the plants that held color into August. Look for the deep root crowns at harvest. Look for the ears that set full kernels even when the plants were under pressure. Plant the toughest ones. He opened the tin box and took out his new envelopes, this year's selections, shelled and tested and labeled in his own hand. He held one up to the kitchen light and felt the weight of the seeds shifting inside. 40 or 50 kernels, descended from a cotton sack handed to a young German immigrant by an old man on the Platte River in the early years of the last century, who had gotten them from someone before him, who had gotten them from someone before that, each selection carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of every drought and heat wave and hard summer they had endured and survived. Die Samenlügen nicht. These seeds do not lie. He understood it now, better than he had when he was young, what his grandfather had meant by that. The lie was always in the brochure, not because the brochure's author was dishonest, but because a brochure could only describe performance under the conditions the brochure imagined. The seeds themselves described something different, something that only years and stress and careful attention could write into them. They told the truth about the land and the climate and the hard reality of what a plant had to be to survive here, in this particular corner of the world, in the dry years as well as the good ones. He put the envelopes back in the tin. He put the lid on. He stretched the rubber band over it with care, the same gesture Karl Brauer had made at this same table, the same gesture Gerhard Brauer had made through the worst years of the farm crisis, when the tin box and the land it represented were sometimes the only things that hadn't been taken. Outside, the January fields lay white and still under a low sky, the same fields that had been broken with a horse and plow 90 years ago, waiting as they had always waited, as they would always wait, for the work and the seeds and the warming of the ground in spring. Ruth came in from the cold, unwrapping her scarf, setting her bag on the chair by the door. She looked at him at the table with his coffee and his tin box, and she didn't say anything, because after 35 years of marriage she knew the difference between a man who was brooding and a man who was simply somewhere deep in himself, in a place that was all right. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. Outside, a single crow crossed the white field and was gone. The summer of 2002 remains the driest in Colfax County records since the late 1930s. Several counties across the Central Plains recorded corn crop losses exceeding 50%. It was also the year that a handful of Nebraska farmers quietly began an effort to document and preserve open-pollinated corn varieties maintained by individual farm families across multiple generations. Some of that work traces its beginning to a farmstead 8 miles west of Schuyler, and to a dented red tobacco tin that sits to this day in a root cellar behind a weathered barn, its lid held by a single rubber band, its contents worth more than any number on any contract that any company man ever set down on a folding table in a concrete block hall.